but which are at the moment being finalized. At the same time, we have at the moment, of course, we're living in a crisis, the coronavirus crisis, which is affecting our economies, our workers, but also the renewable energy world, in particular the solar world, which has been acknowledging a phase of renaissance in the last month, in 2019, 2020. And we're developing now at EU level instruments and budgets to relaunch the economy. And these plans are giving a certain space for renewables and solar. And so we believe that now is really the time to ask us how are all of these tools, all of these budgets and instruments and law developed at EU level used at national level, and how can we really unlock the solar potential at national level in the Czech Republic with the help of the European Union. So that's what today we propose to do in the sort of short stakeholders meeting, briefing, webinar, and we're glad to introduce you to this topic with short presentations, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions in the chat, so don't hesitate. So the menu today is, I will do a short introduction, and then we'll have the great pleasure to hear all of our panelists. So Michaela Oll from DGNR, a policy officer on DGNR who has worked on NCPs. Marek Dahubka from a policy officer at DG Comp, who will talk about recovery plan, and then Jan Kmar from Solani Associates, who will share a bit the perspective from the Czech Republic. And then, of course, we'll have some time for discussions and Q&A. So if you allow me to say a few words from the perspective of Solar Power Europe, I would like to share first, to start with a vision of the renewable energy system in the next years. Because Solar Power Europe has recently published a new study called the 100% Renewable Europe, which is a modeling of the energy system by 2050, which we made with the La Parenta University, which is a university which has an energy able to model the energy system in Europe. And this study has found the graph that you see here, and has found that that if we want to reach climate neutrality, we'll have to rely a lot more on solar. In the moderate scenario, where we reach climate neutrality in 2050, based on a 100% renewable energy system, we reach around 60% of solar penetration by 2050, a share that reaches 63% in the leadership scenario, where we reach climate neutrality in 2040, and again based on a 100% renewable energy scenario. So we see a really paradigm shift, I think, in the European energy system, and a lot more space for renewable energy technologies, and in particular solar, due to cost decrease that we have acknowledged in the past years, and also due to scalability. And I have to say that the results of this study are results from a perfectly independent university, the La Parenta University, which has developed their own modeling. And even Solar Power Europe was surprised with such high scenarios. That's also a good news, because solar, what we found from this study is that 100% renewable energy system based on such large capacity from solar is also the most cost-efficient way to become climate neutral by 2050. We see that in the moderate scenario, where we reach climate neutrality in 2050 based on a 100% renewable energy system, we have costs that are 6% lower than the laggard scenario, which we call less ambitious, where we reach climate neutrality without 100% renewables. So indeed, we see that here, thanks to an ambitious development and adequate policies modernizing the grids, developing adequate sources of flexibility, and relying on renewables that are increasingly cost efficient, we reach a cost-efficient energy system. So I think these elements are really elements to take into account when we look at at the economic recovery in Europe and the investments we need to do at the moment. Another element to take into account is the jobs. We have found in our study that solar could bring around 1 million jobs in the EU by 2050, by 2030 only, sorry, and around 4 million by 2050. We have seen that small scale and rooftop PV installations are particularly interesting because they bring 3 times more jobs per capacity unit than large scale one, and they often rely on local installer companies, local project developers companies, etc. The JRC, the Joint Research Centers, has shown that jobs in installation, operation, and maintenance are also particularly suited for economically transitioning regions, provided the right, of course, the right trainings in place. But there is a potential here. And there is even a potential at exports, because we see that the downstream segment know-how, so by downstream I mean project development, operation, maintenance of solar plants. So this European knowledge that we have in all of these activities, we are globally competitive, and we have even capacities to export, with 2 European companies being in the top 10 global project developers. So that's why we believe that there is really an opportunity in renewable energy technologies. It's not missed. I mean, it's anyway an investment that should have happened, because we believe that renewable energy technologies are the future. And now that we are asking the questions of creating new economic activities, investing into the future, solar and investing in solar and in renewables is a no-regret investment. And for that, using the economic recovery plans in the right way is of course key. But of course, we also need an adequate regulatory framework, and keep building this adequate regulatory framework through the National Energy and Climate Plans, the NCPs, which are the plans that will give a vision to the industry, but also the right tools to invest. So that's why we have called for ambitious and sound NCP to be delivered. We're at the moment analyzing the one from the Czech Republic in the light of the recent event, and we hope that they will deliver. So that's for the main elements that I wanted to share with you from the Solar Power Europe perspective and the European perspective. I propose that we now move on to the first panelist, Michaela, and then we'll move to questions at the end. So, Michaela, if you want to share, I have a question for you.
Thank you for the slide. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I didn't really prepare any intervention. I didn't know. But okay, so about the NECPs and the Czech Republic. Well, we all know what was submitted. The Czech Republic was not amongst the most ambitious with regard to their contribution to the EU target. They upgraded the final report, but they are still below what the formula would suggest. And in particular, they do not explore the potential of solar and wind, I would say, and generally the buildup of the electricity trajectory over the next decade but it was stagnant in the draft NECP, then it went up a little bit, but if one assumes that there will be a big deployment on smart mobility, for example, we really start, let's say, with hydrogen production, then you will need a lot of additional renewables also. And in the case of the Czech Republic, we also know that during the running of this first NECP, they will need to replace massive amounts that come out of the support system that were put into the grid at the very beginning in the years 2005 to 2007, I believe. And what I missed in the NECP is a little bit more of a discussion on how this repowering will happen, because we also have at the same time the start of the discussions of the coal exiting. So there's a lot of change that will be coming. What we missed also, which would in particular be important for the deployment of solar, is more details on the intended transposition of an enabling framework for citizens initiatives, and so PV PV on buildings that is supported by renewables communities, also PPAs, which are all tools that would allow very cheaply, even without even in the case of a PPA, without the need for support from the state budget, would give more opportunities to PV and wind. The Czech Republic also did not indicate any interest or any concrete interest in cross-border cooperation, because the Czech Republic very often puts forward that the potential is limited, and that even our primes modeling does not indicate that there's a lot more for them on renewables. But in that case, a member state could also explore cooperation mechanisms, pay into the renewables financing mechanism, these kind of things, and that's also not there. With regard to heating, renewables in heating, the bulk is supposed to come from more bioenergy. So basically, in a way, they are stretching a bit what they currently have in place and just push it up. But if one thinks about beyond 2030, you will not be able to do everything with biomass for sustainability reasons. There's, for example, district heating and cooling, which supplies, I think, like more than 1 million people in the Czech Republic with heat. And that would need a systemic approach to change it to renewables, but it can be very easily be based on a heat pump or big supply. And then maybe just to conclude, because we are all now in the Commission, at least, under the impression of what was adopted last week. Last week, we adopted in the Commission a revised budget for 2021 to 2027 and 750 billion additional money for the crisis recovery, of which more than half would be grants that would be given to member states. So massive injection of new money. For example, the modernization fund, where Czech Republic is also one of the, I would say, not the biggest, because I think the biggest was Poland and Germany, but still one of the main beneficiaries, will now have a grant part of 40 billion. And then there's the additional money on the recovery facility for member states. So this is just to basically say that while we should still look at the NECPs, we should also now start to look into this whole new revised budget that has been put in place. For example, in order for member states to access this new money under the Next Generation EU fund, where you can have also grants, not only loans, member states will have to develop recovery plans. So yet another plan, yay, because we already had the NECPs, and then we had, when we proposed the Just Transition Fund, that as an addition to the budget, that was like end of last year, as part of the Green Deal communication, there was the announcement that member states that want to draw on that money have to develop just transition plans. And now for the recovery plan, for the recovery spending and this new facility under Next Generation EU, member states will have to draft recovery plans. And the law says that they should be consistent with the NECPs, but the way it will be run is that they are basically integrated into the semester exercise. So basically what I'm saying, life will get even more complicated. So we will have to look at the NECPs on the one hand, but also into the governance around these recovery plans that will be under the semester. This morning, in preparation for this meeting, I checked again what was the country-specific recommendations that we issued for the Czech Republic this year, because basically the recommendations are the most essential thing that the recovery plan should respond to. So they are about reforms, blah, 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 but there's also a reference to green and digital transitions and the need to invest in renewables and this kind of thing. So the plans should, as it says in our law, which was proposed, it still has to be agreed, these recovery plans should respond to all of those challenges, including also green transition. Yeah, so basically there's a lot of additional money on the table that also the Czech Republic could make use of, for example, to transform coal regions and reskill people and deploy large-scale PV and these kind of things. Yeah, so I think I stop there and I can come back later if there are questions.
Sure. Thank you, Michaela, for the introduction and the overview of where you stand. I think this was very useful, and we already have some questions.
I imagine, me too.
So now I'll give the floor to you, Marek. I have your slides and I can pass them while you speak.
Great. Okay, so I'll let you know when I always have to change the slide. So just to introduce myself, so my name is Marek Jahutka. I work in DG competition in a unit dealing with state aid in the energy sector. In particular, also, I mean, in state aid, with state aid concerning the renewable sector. So also cases dealing with the Czech Republic. I will start with the second slide. You will see that actually this slide picks up more or less on the point where Michaela ended her presentation. So I mean, here more or less the two main instruments now that we have at the EU in the, let's say, post-COVID situation and post-COVID scenario, meaning, I mean, the reinforced budget of the EU and also the Next Generation EU financial instrument, which is already mentioned among the many targets which it has. So there is also the digitalization and the, let's say, Green Europe, so meaning also the focus again on the renewable sector. It so like goes hand in hand already with the Green Deal that was announced earlier in the year, so where it was also very much about the sustainability of the European economy in the coming years. So again, I mean, with a strong focus on the on renewables and on green investments in general. When it comes to the role of DG competition and to the role of state aid, so we have to distinguish between the two scenarios. So meaning between direct investments by the EU to the, let's say, to the beneficiaries. In such a situation, the state aid unit does not have to do anything with that because this is a direct investment of EU, not of the member state. So there is no overview by DG competition. But in general, the majority of investments, and this Michaela has already mentioned, goes via the member state. So it means that the member state receives certain money in form of grants or loans, with which it can do, let's say, within the plan that it has submitted, so it can do its own selection of the beneficiaries. In such a situation, this money is considered state aid money, and DG Competition then has to, let's say, review such a scheme or possibly individual aid that is granted to a specific beneficiary. So in such a situation, DG Com will step in, and I mean the Commission in general, and will review such support as it did in the past, also in case of the renewable support in the Czech Republic that was approved then by the Commission. I would move then to the next slide. There you see, I mean, the main, so like 3 pillars at which we look when we review the state aid schemes. So meaning, I mean, now the part where the member states is so like responsible for the selection of the beneficiaries and for the financing. So we so like focused on 3 main, let's say, pillars of the scheme. So meaning, first of all, on the objective of the scheme, which has to be let's say, the environmental objective, the sustainability of the scheme. It has to be affordable, meaning that is always important in case of state aid. So it means that we look always at the proportionality of the aid, that there is no overcompensation. Again, I mean, from the experience in the Czech Republic, so you know that there has been a lot of discussion, and there is a lot of discussion about the past schemes, about their, let's say, affordability and proportionality. So this is, I mean, one of the important pillars that we assess. And the third pillar is the security of supply. So, I mean, we can see it in the, let's say, narrow sense when it comes to the security of supply, I mean, of the renewables, but I mean, in more general view, we also look at the security of supply in relation to the so-called capacity mechanisms that several member states have introduced in the recent years. More or less, these have been developed in order to combine the transformation of the energy sector towards the more renewable aspects, where certain member states are pushing on limits of their, let's say, of their grid and of the generation in member state. So the capacity mechanisms have been introduced, so like to outbalance this transformation of the sector in the coming years. As regards state aid, so we have more or less 2 types. We have either aid that is reviewed by the Commission directly. It means that these are measures which overpass a certain threshold, meaning that they are above certain amounts. In such a case, there is a direct review by the Commission. On the other hand, we have also schemes which are below these financial thresholds, and there are, I mean, as we all call it block exempted. So meaning in such a situation, the member states do not have to go through the, let's say, standard notification procedure, but these schemes are only, let's say, the Commission is only informed about the existence of such schemes, but there is no formal decision by the Commission. When it comes to the current situation in general in the state aid sector, so you can see the number of cases we have approved under the guidelines that we have approved for 2014-2020. So we have here statistics for the first 5 years of the existence of these guidelines. So as you see, I mean, half of the cases that we deal with in the state aid unit concerns the renewable sector. So I mean, not only, I mean, solar, but also, I mean, the other technologies, including also then, for example, the renewable heat that Michaela mentioned. So as you see, this is really the biggest part of our work. There is also a significant part concerning the CHP production, and also a very important part concerning the energy-intensive users, because this is very closely really connected with the renewable scheme. So these concerns reductions of the surcharges with which these schemes are financed for these specific types of electricity consumers, where in many member states, so they received certain reliefs to more or less to defend their competitiveness in the markets where they compete. Then we can move to the next slide. when we talk about the rest support under the guidelines, so we focus more or less on two main issues. One issue is the reduction of the cost, and the other issue is the reduction of the competition distortions. I will maybe start with the competition distortion. So as you probably know, so the renewables nowadays are obliged to sell their electricity in the market. So it's with the new guidelines, or I mean with the current guidelines, it's no more about tariffs, fixed tariffs that they would receive, but they receive only premiums to the market price that they receive on the market. So they are not outside of the market, which also means that they are exposed to the same responsibilities as any other generator of electricity, including balancing responsibilities. And what is important, I mean, they cannot receive any aid in cases when the prices on the market are negative. So meaning when there is actually oversupply, so there is no interest to support even more production of electricity. The biggest, I would say, the biggest change with the guidelines came with the introduction of the competitive bidding process, something with, for example, with which the Czech Republic does not have still that much of experience, but in many other member states, so the competitive auctions have been already introduced a couple of years ago, and they have been already running at the moment. It's a condition nowadays under the guidelines to have the competitive bidding process. There are only exceptional situations when these tenders do not have to take place. This is in particular in case of small installations, but it can also concern specific situations. So I mean, in general, you cannot run a competitive bidding process if the market is not competitive. So this is a situation when you do not have that much of competitors that can participate in the auctions, so it would not secure let's say the decrease of the prices. And in such a situation, member state can indeed decide to discontinue the auctions. And there are also specific limitations in case of the competitive process for specific possibly technologies if they are not advanced. So meaning you have a new technology that is, for example, very expensive because it's new, it's not still tested on the market. So in such a situation, the member state can decide to put this technology outside of the competitive bidding process. There are also, I mean, then other possible exclusions from the bidding process, such example, grid constraints. If you have, for example, a certain part of the country which is where you have concentrated renewables production. So in such a situation, you can also possibly limit the participation, for example, of the installations from this region, not to possibly, because this could, I mean, trigger even more grid constraints in the country. For what is important for the rules, I have mentioned they have been in place since 2014. They should have been in place until end of 2020. Nevertheless, the Commission announced last year that there will be an extension of these guidelines by 2 years. So it means until end of 2022, which also means that we have been already now working on the new set of rules. I will speak about it a bit later. So it means that there would be new guidelines that would replace the current guidelines, and that will also then play again, I mean, an important role for the, for example, producers of renewable electricity in Czech Republic, because these rules will be then the ones that will possibly be in place when a new support scheme in Czech Republic is developed. Can we then move to the next slide? This is something we can just go through it very quickly. I mean, this just shows the importance of the competitive bidding process when it comes to the level of prices. So here you see how the prices developed between 2015 and 2018 in Germany. In case of so photovoltaic energy, so when the competitive bidding process was introduced, so as you see, I mean, following that, the prices have dropped to almost to half of the price that was granted under the administrative premium. So we see similar development also in other member states, as you possibly have noticed. So in case, for example, of offshore wind, so there have been even auctions in certain member states where the resulting premium was zero. So we expect that with the advancement of the technology in the coming years, so we will see more cases like that. So now we can move to the next slide, which already will touch upon the new rules, the new set of rules that I have mentioned. So we have launched the fitness check, which is more or less, I mean, a review of the existing guidelines last year. So there was already a public consultation where the stakeholders could provide their feedback on the functioning of the rules, what they consider a positive or negative. So this has already finished. So now we are so like reviewing this input from the market, from the stakeholders, from the member states, and on the basis of that, so the intention is now to prepare the new set of rules. There should be a public consultation concerning these new rules in the first half of next year. And the foreseen adoption date for the new rules should be then in the second half of 2021. We can then move to the next slide where you can see so like the main, let's say, outcome of this fitness check that I have mentioned. So in general, I think that the experience from both member states and the stakeholders, I mean, meaning the participants in the market, have been positive overall. It means that what was always emphasized is the good experience with the competitive bidding process, which led to the decrease of prices, and also to, let's say, to a technological development of the market, because there is a push on the reduction of prices. There was what was emphasized is that there should be more work done in relation to the decarbonization in general, because as you know, I mean, the Green Deal, I mean, very much emphasized, for example, the question of decarbonization of the industry in general. So we can expect that also the new rules will very much focus on the decarbonization. The question also of the security of supply, I've mentioned the capacity mechanisms at the beginning. So this is something which was introduced in the guidelines for the first time in 2014. So we have identified certain shortcomings when it comes to the functioning of the capacity mechanisms. So there will be some reflection on that. And there has been also then a discussion, I mean, when it comes to the stated objectives in general. So there was what was mentioned was the question again of the possible further reductions of the costs and of compensation. And so there is there is still, let's say, there is a lot of big field, I mean, where we can further discuss, I mean, how the auctions should be designed, how far can the exemptions go, how far can should the member states go with the participation from other member states, because Michaela again already mentioned, for example, the case of Czech Republic, which does not have, let's say, the best conditions for the development of renewables. So there could be possibility for the Czech Republic, for example, to allow for foreign participation. So these are all questions that should be still discussed. So we can move to the final slide that I have prepared, which already picks up upon the points that I have mentioned a bit. So that first of all, I mean, we cannot take now the revision of the guidelines, let's say, in isolation. So we have to look also in the development of not only of the Green Deal and the recovery plan, but also on the review of the regulatory framework in general. So we have the so-called clean energy package. We have a possible revision of the renewables targets for 2030 on the table. We have a possible revision of the energy efficiency directive in view. So all these things can impact again the design of the state aid guidelines for the support of electricity in Europe. So we have to take this into account, and also to leave, let's say, the wording of the guidelines sufficiently open so that we can possibly, or that we don't have to amend those guidelines every time there is a change of these goals, that it can be sort of like absorbed in the wording of the guidelines as they stand. What is also important is that we have to take into account the development, the technological development of the industry. A classic example is, for example, the case of storage, which has not been too much reflected in the current guidelines. So, I mean, they only speak about storage attached to a renewable installation. But as you have seen, I mean, the storage has developed as a standalone, let's say, product on the market, not attached to any generation. The same applies also, for example, to hydrogen, I mean, which has been now becoming more and more important as a future tool in the energy sector. So these has to be taken into account as well. And finally, we have to also reflect, I mean, in general, on the even higher and higher penetration of renewables in the market, which goes hand in hand with the decrease of the prices. So, I mean, we can then touch upon, in general, on the question of the need for state aid, whether there will be still need even for state aid concerning the renewables in the coming years, because as you can expect, I have mentioned the zero prices. So then it's the question, okay, how do we need, I mean, any support for the renewables at all? Then additional question that, again, Michal has already mentioned is, for example, the question of the low emission mobility, or, I mean, electric cars, etc. So, I mean, these are all questions that we still have to reflect on when it comes to the new rules. So, yeah, so I think this is it from my side. So
thank you, Marek, for this quite extensive overview of what's happening on your side and what's the role of DG Comp in national energy policy. So now I'll give the floor to Jan. So should I pass the slides as well?
That's okay. I can show them myself. But you have to unshare your screen.
You share your screen?
I can share my screen, so you don't have to click. Thank you. Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Sorry about that. Okay, apparently I can't share my screen. So if I could ask you to do it, sorry about that.
Sure, no problem. Okay, here we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining. My name is Jan Krčmář. I'm the chairman of the Czech Solar Association. Maybe just a quick word about us. We're the largest professional association dealing with solar energy in the Czech Republic. We're made up of installation companies, investors, power plant owners and providers, banks who invest in solar energy, but also just individuals, and we have a lot of members from the academic sector. So that's shortly us. I would like to start off on the first slide by basically continuing on where my predecessors left off. We currently in the Czech Republic have 2 gigawatt of solar power installed. On certain days, that means that solar power produces 20% of electricity used that day, typically on summer or moreover spring and autumn days. But the vast majority of power plants is 10 years or older, and I will get back to why that is in a moment. Now, there is, however, if I could ask for the next slide, there is a vast potential beyond what we've seen, and I would maybe like to continue on from what Michaela said. According to one of our studies, which we commissioned, the technical potential of the Czech Republic is 30 gigawatts, and that is only brownfields, rooftops, and facades, so that is not in any form agricultural land. There is an economic potential, according to several studies, of about 7 gigawatts that could be installed feasibly by 2030, and the NECP, so the climate plan, foresees 2 gigawatts of solar by 2030. The role of solar power is, if I could ask for the next slide, thank you, is, you know, we can play an important role because we are planning now, we're discussing the coal exit, which is beginning. You know, this resonates with the population that demands, especially in those regions affected, an exit sooner rather than later. You know, there's a potential for cultivating former coal pits with solar PV. The reason why I mentioned agricultural land is because we currently have a first generation biofuel that takes up 100 times more square meters than solar power, which, and again, solar power, for more and more studies, looks like it's quite a good way of letting agricultural land rest after it's been exploited heavily. There is potential for other renewables, but very limited. We don't have that much water left, and we don't really have courageous local politicians that stand up for wind parks in their regions, which is quite a shame, I have to say. Thank you. Could have asked for the next slide. Thank you. But to compare this to what we are now, we saw a doubling of solar energy in the Czech Republic last year. 3,500 new plants installed, but still it is just 25 megawatts. And if you know solar power energy, 25 megawatts is almost nothing. This is compared to, for example, Poland, where we had 800 megawatts, or Austria, where it was about 10 or 15 times more. It is almost nothing. And in the statistics in the Czech Republic, you don't even see a growth on the graph anymore. And there are several reasons for this. If I could ask for the next slide. If we look at the plan that the NECP foresees for solar power and current projection, the current growth rate, which I have already pushed, I think, to the limits, you see there's a big gap between where we need to be and where we are at now, and where we will be if nothing dramatically changes. It would take, at the current growth rate, about 70 years to meet the targets that we will need to fulfill in the next 10 years. There are, and if I can go to the next slide, there are several reasons for that. First of all, which Michaela already mentioned, there are no initiatives by the states to push new forms that might even, as she mentioned, exist without any state aid, especially solar PPAs or local communities. You know, we've seen in other member states initiatives from the states to inform and to push, but PPAs are not even mentioned in the NECP. And there is also a fixation on rooftop PV, where currently we see that all new PV has to be installed on rooftops. There's not currently a discussion on getting back or down from the rooftops and building in larger numbers. Going forward, the Czech Republic wants to introduce renewables auctions, but automatically exclude solar by law from participating in these auctions. And I mean, Marek mentioned that there are, of course, you know, member states can justify excluding or tailoring auctions to match their provisions, but in our opinion, this is not justified because the government has not really come up with any geographical or economic explanations for it. Instead, they want to focus on investment subsidies, which, if we talk to investors and banks, they're not attractive enough to convince people to invest. And there is, for the last 10 years, there is an ongoing smear campaign, a negative campaign against solar energy, which has led to a lack of PV companies active on the Czech markets. If you could go forward to the next slide, which is I promise a brief history on solar energy in the Czech Republic. In 2005, the Czech government, the then government, passed the Czech version of the German Erneuerbare Energiegesetz, which I'm sure you know is the mother of all renewables laws in Europe. The law guaranteed 20-year feed-in prices or feed-in tariffs for companies. In the beginning, we didn't really see that much being built because the prices were quite low and the technology price is high. But in 2009, 2010, a lot of technology was suddenly being manufactured in China. Panel prices or technology prices overall dropped sharply, which led to a solar boom where in 2 years we installed 2 gigawatts, the 2 gigawatts that we have now. The state, however, failed to introduce a cap on those projects. So what happened is that thousands of households and companies from small to large invested. built more than 20,000 power plants across the country within basically 2 years, most of them in 2010. Which meaning they all went to the banks, all got money from investors, took out huge bank loans, and built those power plants. And as I say, this is companies from households to SMEs, tiny companies like bakeries who just put up 50 kilowatts on the roofs, to local factories to put up, let's say, 200, 300 on the roofs, to larger companies who invested in large-scale power plants. Because, as you know, this was right after the financial crash, where a lot of companies were looking for means where to invest the money. So this actually looked like an interesting scheme. The state guarantees a 20-year feed-in tariff. Back then, bank loans were not really cheap. So with what the state guarantees, this looked like an interesting investment, which is why it attracted a lot of companies, even from abroad, to the Czech Republic. But the failure of the government to introduce, for example, a maximum number of power plants or megawatts that could be installed, left the state with a huge bill to be paid every year, owing to this large number of projects, which obviously puts a burden on the public budget for also the energy consumers who also pay a share of this. If I could ask for the next slide, please. Thank you. The states, because they failed to act, what they did is they tried to deflect from their own failure by putting the blame on the companies and people who invested, and they branded them as solar barons, perpetuating this myth that all of the solar power plants are owned by a handful of companies, that most of them sit somewhere in the Seychelles and just live off the huge subsidies the state pays them. But in reality, as I say, those are normal companies. Those are thousands of companies that just invested, and the large bill that the state is settled with is not due to this enormous feed-in tariff, but largely due to this enormous amount of companies that all make up this large bill. What the state did then, that in 2010, the government introduced a 26% solar levy, which basically meant deducting 26% from the feed-in tariff, where the government said, if we introduce this for 3 years, this will automatically correct the high feed-in tariff, lower the burden on the public budget, and avoid any or correct any possible overcompensation. Then after 3 years, the government said, well, actually, we have changed our minds. We have to extend it for the remainder of the entire feed-in periods of 20 years, but at 10%. And the Deputy Minister for Industry, before Parliament, on record said, and this will make sure that there is no overcompensation. Sadly, in total, there were 7 changes retroactively to the solar energy business, including double recycling fees, changes in taxation and depreciation, more technical burdens put on investors, and each time those investors had to go back to the banks. Banks lowered, in many cases, after the solar tax, actually lowered the amount of money they borrowed them, so investors had to get the money from somewhere else at much higher interest rates. Some companies, and we saw arbitrations against the Czech Republic, one of which the Czech Republic lost recently. And as each time that the government swore, okay, this is the last thing, and now it's fine, don't worry. As I said, this never really happens. We can go forward, please. The effect was that for several years we have almost no solar power being built. In fact, in some years the total capacity actually decreased because some power plants lost their license. We saw attacks on companies and investors from politicians and media, but also effects like neighbors attacking neighbors because they had solar power on the roofs. A few cases of rocks being thrown on solar power plants, which I know happened in a lot of other countries. We also saw some cases where local authorities wouldn't grant building permits to solar power, rooftop power plants for no apparent reason. And most of the Czech companies that build solar power plants just left to invest elsewhere. We now have companies building power plants as far as Australia or India because it is more, it is more stable environments. Naomi, you mentioned employment. At the height of the solar boom, we had about 15,000 people employed. Now, and this is a very optimistic number. It's about 5,000, including all the people to look after the solar power plants. So we've seen a drop in those numbers as well. I could ask you go forward. Yeah. Now we are in a new situation where let's say for the last 2 years, where there is a big threat to solar PV and renewables in general, which is the so-called overcompensation problem, and the possible return or IRRs for various renewable energy sources. The Czech Republic had to, of course, notify the law governing the state aid with the European Commission, which includes checks, and the notification includes the provision that the Czech Republic should make sure there is no overcompensation. However, in the notification document, it actually still, the Czech Republic, the Czech side says that there should be actually no current overcompensation because the solar taxes already took care of that. However, despite that, the ministry has currently been carrying out overcompensation evaluations anyway, which have the form that the Ministry of Industry always takes one sector. For example, solar power plants from, let's say, 1 year from 2009 are one sector. They evaluate the average return on these projects, and they say, well, we allow an average number, percentage, and if power plants are over that number on average, then we will lower the feed-in tariff or reduce the feed-in tariff. The notification document includes a range, an acceptable range, which says that, you know, if the power plants are within this range, then it should be all right. For solar power plants, this range was 6.3% to 8.4%. Each renewable energy source has a different IRR. The highest being for biogas and biomass, which are 10.6%. If you can go on to the next slide, please. This all is subject of a law which is being currently discussed, a law amendment, which has been prepared for, I think, over 2 years now, which has drawn quite a lot of criticism from huge organizations, not of course only from us, but also from, let's say, the Confederation of Industry, the Chamber of Commerce, the Energy Regulatory Office, some other ministries. The main focus was the discrimination in different IRRs, where the Czech Republic says, you know, we allow different investors to basically earn different money from, or have different returns. For 2 years, the government insisted that the IRR for solar power should be 8.4%. And in all versions of the law amendments, the government said no, solar power will have an IRR of 8.4%, meaning that we carry out those overcompensation evaluations. And if the average of solar power plants earns less than 8.4%, then it's fine. If it's over 8.4%, then we will lower the feed-in tariff. The ministry already carried out hundreds of evaluations and stated that there is no overcompensation on these projects. And they will now this year be evaluating the vast majority of solar power plants that were built in 2010. We can move on, please. But then on the 22nd of April 2020, there was a big change where the government suddenly said, well, actually, the acceptable IRR for solar power is not 8.4 that it had been communicating for 2 years, but 6.3%. And as I told you, that in the notification document, every renewable energy source has a range of a bottom and a top margin of the range. And all the other renewable energy sources are allowed the higher end of the range of the margin, and only solar power will receive the lowest margin. We don't really know how this happened because the governments met on a Monday, and on Friday afternoon the ministry submitted to the government, and of course this is an open public consultation process, a version of the law which again included those 8.4%, and suddenly over the weekend something happens. When a journalist asked the Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Industry who proposed this 6.3% for solar, this sudden change, he answered that it was the European Commission, which, I mean, I don't know specifically, but I very much doubt that's the case. However, this is not a surprise because the government has very often tried to blame everything on the European Commission and said, we're only doing this because the European Commission wants us. The main reason we feel is because, as I explained, solar power is not a popular player in the Czech Republic. We have been the victim, the scapegoat for many, many years. Still resonates for many voters, and the minister had actually for the last year several times been saying that thanks to these overcompensation controls, the government will be able to save billions of crowns, which is hundreds of millions of euro every year. despite the fact that these the vast majority of these controls had not actually happened or hasn't even been beginning. So it's a bit like a football manager knowing the results before the game has even kicked off, which is a bit worrying for us. If we could go forward to the next slide. Now, it might not sound that much, 8.4%, 6.3%, you might wonder why is that such a problem? It's still not 20%, it's still not 0%. However, this is 6.3% over the entire lifespan of the project. I've already mentioned the bank loans that companies have to take over or take on to build those power plants. A lot of them, or most, we did a flash survey in the past weeks among hundreds of power plant owners. The majority of power plant owners have interest rates that are higher than 6%. So if you then, of course, calculate in operational costs and maintenance costs, you will not have any money to run the power plant. To cut the IRR over a sector by 1% means a 20% cut in the feed-in tariff, which means that if the result of these overcompensation evaluations see that, let's say, solar power plants have an IRR of 8.3%, then the government will have to cut the feed-in tariff by 40 to 50%, roughly, our estimations, to get the average down to 6.3%, which means cutting income of companies by 50%, which, of course, especially in the current crisis where companies are already struggling, is not really positive. And of course, we know that the government had already last year and the year previous carried out sector controls for power plants from 2006 to 2009 that had shown that power plants from this period are below 8.4%. So we are now wondering why the government has carried out these controls and now actually suddenly changed the IRR to 6.3%, the acceptable higher margin. We could go further.
Yes, Jan, I'll have to rush you a bit if you want 2 minutes for questions.
The last slides now. Again, why are we actually talking about solar power? Solar power makes up the majority of renewables in the electricity sector. This would have a huge knock-on effect, not only for solar power plants, but the first ones to call us were obviously banks who are worried about bank loans in the billions of euros. They fear bankruptcies, same as the companies who call us in the last few weeks. There are new arbitrations on the horizon, and maybe we can go quickly to the last slides. The effect will be far beyond solar, because if banks lose their bank loans in as I say, billions of euros, companies go bankrupt. This will send shockwaves not only through the banking sector, which might then see renewables as a risky investment, but also the companies who are currently preparing maybe some renewables projects might pack up and say, no, we'll invest our money elsewhere. We've already invested in Poland, Australia. There is no reason to go back to us. Of course, again, which Michaela mentioned, the question of repowering of the current solar power plants. If a lot of companies go bankrupt, then there's no guarantee that those 2 gigawatts will be there after 2030. And then the question is, who provides those 20% on those certain days where solar makes up 20%? The answer is probably coal or imports or nuclear power, which we are currently building. Solar itself will be more expensive, or renewables, because the state will have to offer investors a much more attractive scheme to lure them back after these, to reassure them. And if you can go maybe further to I think that's one of the last slides. This obviously has a knock-on effect far beyond solar power, because, as I said, wind power suffers from a lack of commitment of politicians who are willing to push through wind power. I myself, I grew up in Austria, so I remember the debates about solar wind power growing up in Austria, where you had local politicians convince people and convince communities that this is the way forward. I don't think we will have this in the Czech Republic if the government clearly communicates that they want to basically, take the hands of renewable power. And of course, there's a precedence, because if you change the rules 10 years later, 10 years after people invested, the question is, what is next? And the last thing potentially is that on the same day that the government announced this change with solar power, they also announced plans to build, or detailed plans to build, new nuclear reactors with big state guarantees, a feed-in tariff, or contract for difference, a premium, but also state loans, and an option to purchase the nuclear reactors from this company if they become economically not feasible, which I think are all conditions which solar investors which currently jump upon. So maybe, you know, summing up for myself is the reason why we're doing this seminar is we're quite worried about being left behind. You know, we see the train that most of Europe is boarding now with the Green Recovery deal going one direction, trying to see the Corona crisis as an opportunity to actually do something and not let this opportunity go to waste. And we're a bit worried that we're boarding maybe a different train on another track that will take us elsewhere, and also geographically, because we probably know who will build these new nuclear reactors, and I think that would be a shame. So from us, you know, the only thing I can ask you is, you know, watching, maybe ask, you know, write about this, ask people why this is happening, and ask what the knock-on effects of this will be. That's all from me. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking up more than your time, more of your time that you may have expected.
No problem. There's a lot to learn on the Czech situation. So maybe I would like your reaction, Michaela and Marek, on what's happening in the Czech Republic. I think from Solar Power Europe's perspective, what we see, I mean, there is on your side, Jan, a lot of let's say tension and expectations on these on the Czech Republic's situation. On Solar Power Europe side, I think what we can share is that there is we see a lot of opportunities. Our members are looking at the Czech Republic to invest. So basically, to answer to our members and to the national actors that are expecting a lot from the European Commission and from the European Union on the development of renewables nationally, what can the European Union do? Maybe through the NECPs. Michaela, you said that the Commission will publish an assessment of the NECPs, and I had a question from the chat on what would be the date, and maybe Marek, will the new stated guidelines include, and can they, yeah, what's the role of the DG Comp and the stated guidelines in dealing with such situation, and will they include, for example, reference to the fact that we cannot have retroactive changes to energy laws as per the clean energy package? So if you could share a quick thoughts on this.
Marek, do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, I mean, you can go ahead if you are already on the mic. Then I can
Sorry. Voila. So no, I just wanted to say basically one thing, because I digged a little bit into the state aid issue, and Marek will complement because he's the expert. But just to say that basically how I understood the state aid agreement that was reached with the Czech Republic and DG Comp, it clearly said there will be a review after 10 years. So basically you knew from the beginning that there would be a review of this internal rate of returns. Now, I am not fully sure how it is organized on the Czech side. If now they are reviewing basically the ones that went online in 2010, then that seems to be in line with that announcement. And then but Marek will know that more. So basically just the background that, I mean, they say they blame, of course, the DG Competition doesn't say it has to be 6.3%, but there is a range that was indicated that goes from 6.3%, and there was clearly communicated that after 10 years there will be a review. But okay, I'll leave that to Mark to complement. In the new renewables directive that also the Czech Republic will have to transpose by mid next year, although as you might know, we are already launching the revision before it's even implemented, but okay, that's how it is. But the revised renewables directive, as negotiated last year, has this clause about that you cannot have retroactive changes, that there has to be a stability of support, that member states have to provide 5 years ahead schedules. But even in the article on the retroactive changes, it says clearly, unless a possible review in the future is already announced at the time of the law, so that basically an investor knows that this is a possibility and can adjust his business calculation and accommodate this additional risk in a way. So let's say, so even in the future, if a law is properly announced in such a way, you could even in the future still correct support given at some point. So that would be from my side. No, one more addition, if I may, on the zero bits. It's maybe less relevant for solar and the need for state aid. I would like to say that what we've seen when we helped preparing the recovery package that was adopted, that we saw that the solar and the wind markets are severely hit, and that we expect both of them to contract by around 25% or 30% this year, and that effect will carry on into the next year. There is a slump in energy demand, there's a slump in wholesale prices, the ETS prices are more erratic and lower. And finally, there will be regions and actors after this crisis who will not be in a position anymore to have this upfront investments that you need in many cases when it comes to renewables, also renewables and storage and newer things. You need upfront investment that you need the money, first of all, and that is maybe for smaller actors and actors that went through a COVID shock, not so obvious. And on the zero subsidy bit, because I happen to work on the offshore strategy here, and just over the weekend a new project was announced off the Dutch coast. Vattenfall would be the biggest, I think, if it's being built. It will be built soon. They bid zero, but and I think the but and the footnote is always very important in that. They can only bid zero because there is a de-risking and guarantee and an enabling context around. So basically in that case, the Dutch guaranteed the license, the offshore license for a certain amount of time. I don't know the details. And more importantly, the Dutch government guaranteed the grid connection. So it was only with these two conditions that a zero bid was possible. And I think this is very important because some people like to take this zero bid, which is a positive development, these cost reductions, out of its context. But these zero bids, I think they don't fall from the sky. Usually they are the result of a very enabling policy framework that then accommodates the risk of people in other ways also. I think that is also important to understand. And upscaling renewables to 85% in 2050, it's possible that this doesn't have any costs for the public. It has to. And I think this has to be made clear also. Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Michaela. So yeah, Marek, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe just start with the last point that Michaela mentioned. I mean, this is indeed what we also see. I mean, it's also a bit outside of the topic, but what we see in other member states that they actually want to include the grid connection in the, let's say, in the bids for the offshore installation. So it means actually to then put the cost on the side of the investor for the grid connection in order to prevent these zero bids to happen. So this is indeed, I mean, something that I think that where the member states learned the lesson, and where they, I mean, also saw the opportunity how to achieve further reductions of the prices, because the grid connection, if it's indeed built as measured directly on the size of the offshore installation, can also then lead to quite big cost savings. When it comes to the question of zero bids in more general, I think that this is indeed why the auctions are so important, and I've mentioned that because I think that they are so like the best indication for us to see where the market goes. So it means we see it very, very well on the auctions, on the development of the prices, how the future in the renewable sector should look like. So how investors are confident when it comes to the future prices. in the energy sector, in the electricity market. So I think that we can really learn a lot from the results of these auctions about the confidence of the market in general. When it comes to the situation in Czech Republic and to these retroactive changes to the tariffs, meaning to the changes of the internal rate of return. So, I mean, Michaela mentioned, I mean, the two main elements. So on the one hand, and I mean, Jan mentioned that too, I mean, there is indeed in the decision a certain range where the internal rate of return was approved as a, let's say, acceptable range for the Commission. So it means that there is some sort of like space for maneuvering for the Czech government. Secondly, there was also indeed a mechanism agreed in the decision from 2016 that there will be a review of the rate of returns at a certain moment. And again, I mean, Jan mentioned that. I mean, we as DG Comp now, we don't know the background why the Czech government decided that in case of the solar installations, the internal rate of return will be at this level, and for other installations it will be at a different level. So we are not that far in our investigation of that situation. I think what is important to say in general about state aid, as you know, I mean, state aid is always something on the top of, let's say, the normal market situation. There are rulings of the European Court which say that there is actually no right for state aid. It means that a member state can indeed decide in specific situations, for example, to terminate the aid completely. So it's not unusual that a member state decides that either it will lower the aid or it will terminate the aid, depending on the circumstances in the financing of the support measures. Having said that, I mean, really for this, let's say for the specific case of the Czech renewable sector and photovoltaic sector, I think we cannot really say at the moment much because we are, I mean, so like now, let's say in the waiting mode for more information from the stakeholders and also from the government. So yeah, so I think this is what I can say for the moment.
Okay, maybe Jan, on this question that Marek just raised, why is there such a difference in the rate of returns from solar and other energies? At a point where a lot of organizations, including the Commission, has pointed the importance of electrification. I understand that in Czech Republic some explanations are circulated. So do you, on your side, have explanations on this?
It's well, I mean, we know very publicly that the top government officials just don't like solar energy from the president down. We've been, solar barons, criminals, and so on and so forth on a regular basis. The minister itself last year called the support scheme fraud or fraudulent, implying that solar investors are fraudsters. We can only speculate why other renewable energy sources are allowed a higher return, especially if you compare 6.3 and 10.6. That's quite a big difference, you know. There are speculations, and again, only speculations. We know that the Prime Minister's former company, that's according to our Prime Minister used to own a very, very big company. That's according to some EU investigations, he still has some control over. They own some biogas plants. I don't want to, of course, accuse them of anything, but in a situation where suddenly, all of a sudden you hear that solar energy will be allowed 6.3% and biomass and biogas 10.6%, you do start to wonder. If I could just come back to 2 points that were mentioned. Yes, Michaela and Marek are absolutely right. It was agreed that 10 years after the installations, these controls will be happening. But as Marek said, this was agreed not at the time of installations, not at the time that the investors invested their money and took all those bank loans, but later when the law was notified. So at the time when the investors were making those decisions, there was no indication that this will be happening. And still, this would not be a problem. You know, you might say, okay, well, 10 years later, we'll see if you're not getting more money than expected. Again, that's not a problem. The problem is that had investors been communicated an internal rate of revenue of 6.3%, 10 years ago when they made the investment, I doubt that anybody would have invested because, you know, as I said, bank loans were very high. And just for comparison, government bonds were almost guaranteeing you 6%. So any right investor in the right mind would not, enter a business market with all the risk that is involved if you can basically just buy government bonds and make almost the same money or maybe a little less, you know. I mean, I know that if you talk to investors and you try to convince them to invest something that has an IRR of less than 10%, it's usually quite difficult. And all of this would not be a problem if these tiny things wouldn't happen. For example, the minister telling us how much money he will save from those overcompensation checks before they were even carried out. And those things are quite difficult for us to understand. And especially the other thing is being told for 2 years, clearly in all government documents and government decisions in all drafts from the ministry, that the acceptable IRR for solar power plants will be 8%. And then suddenly this changed. I mean, we have companies who bought into the Czech market in the last 2 years, who acquired solar power plants, who calculated the IRR of the acquisitions they made, figured out that it's below 8.4%, and made those investments relying on what the state has been, what they were communicated from the states. And this is now being turned on its head. And the other dangerous precedent is that for 2 years the government said, if we find out that the average of power plants is overcompensated, but you are not, then we will have to prove to you that you are overcompensated. So we will lower the feed-in tariff for everybody else except for you, and you will receive an individual control. And if we can prove that you are overcompensated, then we also cut your support. Now the government completely throws this around and says, if there is overcompensation on average, we will cut everybody's support, and companies will have to prove that they're innocent. And with this, we have a very big problem. And even the government's own legal counsel saw this as problematic because you are basically shifting the burden of proof. You have to claim that you're innocent, that you're not overcompensated. And of course, once the government cuts your income by 20 to 50%, you don't have the money to pay legal fees. I mean, you won't have the money to expect, to weigh those controls, and which is, for example, what the government's own legal counsel heavily criticized. So those are these small, on the face of it, small changes that make this whole move by the government a bit weird. Because as we say, we knew about the controls, sure, not a problem. We didn't know that the government would announce beforehand how they would end. We didn't know that the government would already make calculations on some power plants, see what the average IRR of those power plants are, and then change the IRR, the highest acceptable rate. Because that, I think that is quite a dangerous precedent to set.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm sorry, really past the time, but maybe a very quick question from the panel, from the audience. Does the Czech Republic government assess new nuclear build to be cheaper than solar PV? How they justified their decision? And direct question, is the nuclear industry behind the smear campaign against PV? If you could share small remarks very quickly. And
both questions is no. The government clearly knows that nuclear power is more expensive than building new renewables, new solar power, in particularly. But they justify this with that we're a heavily industrialized country. We need a base load. It is a zero emissions source. So the government is quite open about the fact that nuclear power will be very, very expensive, and they will be changing tariffs for consumers to be able to pay for all of this. And as I said, the government, there's a provision that says that if the company that will build the nuclear power plants, which is a company called ČEZ, which is owned by the states by 2/3, and 1/3 are minority investors. That if the project is economically not feasible, the government will be able to purchase the whole project. So the government already accepts that it might not be actually competitive on the market on its own, and the government argues with stability, energy independence, and so on and so forth. Again, viable arguments, but we would like the same, the same rules for everybody. And I have to say that the nuclear lobby is not behind this. It is just a general reaction of politicians who failed to put a cap on solar power 10 years ago. And of course, the nuclear lobbies maybe, I don't know, they're probably not opposed to the smear campaign. And we know that the president is a big fan of coal and power and has openly said so. So that, yes, but it's not like somebody's not paying PR companies to throw dirt on us from the nuclear lobby. But we are just, being a target of a smear campaign by old energy and by especially politicians who need a quick scapegoat over the last 10 years.
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for this question. I'm sorry, a lot of questions were in the chat and we cannot go through all of them. Marek, Michaela, I will let you the floor if you want to share final remarks and close this webinar, unfortunately.
No, so I mean, maybe from my side, I can only wish the renewable sector and also, the photovoltaic producers in Czech Republic, let's say all the best, in their efforts to make the energy mix of the Czech Republic greener and sustainable. We will see, now very much talked about the past, meaning about the experience with the feed-in tariffs and with the past scheme. I'm sure that this will be still on our table the coming months and maybe years, because it was mentioned there are arbitration cases, but there is also an ongoing case at the European Court concerning the decision. On the other hand, I think that it's also good to look also more into the future. So, I hope that the upcoming scheme that pipeline in the Czech Republic, as we know, for the renewables based on competitive bidding process will be, let's say, a more reliable how to the sector in Czech Republic, and I hope that this will really trigger less and hopefully no legal complaints from the investors, and it will really create a stable investment environment, and hopefully will lead to the, let's say, fulfillment of the targets which are mentioned in the National Energy Plan of Czech Republic.
Thank you a lot, Marek. Michaela, if you want to share final words.
Yeah, no, just to say that I'm aware that it's a difficult investment environment in the Czech Republic. We can compare with other countries. I see that I'm also, you see, for example, in other countries, let's say Germany, that now has lifted restrictions also to accelerate the COVID crisis. These are governmental decisions that they allow more PV. They lifted the cap, which we also encourage to do as part of the COVID crisis. But these are, in the end, it's clear that it's the member state that decides if they want to do nuclear. That's their choice based on the treaty. We can push for correct transposition of the Renewables Directive, and I think there's a lot in it that can help. There is an obligation to have an enabling framework for communities. There is an obligation to have an enabling framework for PPAs. There is an obligation to have these competitive auctions and some advanced, the 5 years predictability. The only thing is, of course, that this transposition is only occurring next year, and it doesn't help you now in the immediate recovery right now. But let's say there's only so much that you can do from the EU level if a government decide a decision is we want to have source X and Y and not the other.
Thank you, Michaela, for the last words and your perspective. I can only share the message of hope that we have for the renewable energy sector in Czech Republic. As Solar Power Europe will remain available and committed to propose solutions and to really unlock the opportunities that we have in the renewable energy industry sector. So we will work with you in the next steps to unlock all of these opportunities. Thank you for listening to us. I think Jan remains available if you have more questions. And on that, I wish you a very nice day.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.